Welcome to Bedhampton Church. Contact us at www.bedhampton.church. But for now, let's continue that journey with this input.
Okay, so today we return to our teaching series on the Gospel of Matthew. And if you haven't done so already, I would urge you to go to the church website and to have a look at the previous sermons we've got on Matthew's Gospel, but also two lovely videos from the Bible Project, and we saw part of one of those a few minutes ago, which give you a really good overview of the whole of the Gospel and what the story is really about. And I'm not going to give you an overview now of the whole of the Gospel of Matthew, although I'm tempted to, but I'm just going to concentrate on chapters 14 to 20 to get us into where we're going in chapter 20. So chapters 14 to 20 of Matthew are a section of the Gospel that deal with different people's expectations about the Messiah, who the Messiah is and what he's going to do. And Jesus, in these chapters, carries on healing sick people, and twice he miraculously provides food for a large crowd, one made up predominantly of Jews and one predominantly non-Jews. And providing food for such a large crowd is reminiscent of what Moses did in the wilderness. And throughout Matthew's Gospel, there's lots of references back to Jesus being compared to Moses. And the crowds are excited about Jesus. The crowds think he's a great prophet. He is the Messiah. The religious leaders, though, on the other hand, have a view of the Messiah based on passages from the Old Testament about a victorious Messiah who's going to deliver Israel and beat the pagan oppressor. And they think that Jesus is a false teacher who's making blasphemous claims. And because of that, they increase their opposition and they make plans to kill him and get rid of him. And Jesus' response to that is to withdraw. And that's a bit we had in the video we looked at. He withdraws and he teaches his closest disciples what it means for him to be the Messiah, which is not what the religious leaders were expecting a Messiah to be. And in chapter 16, he asks the disciples, "Who do you say I am? Who do you say I am?" And they replied, "Some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the other prophets." But what about you? Who do you say I am? And Simon Peter, the one who so often gets it so wrong, Simon Peter turns around and says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Because you see, Peter got it. He knew who Jesus was. He got it. However, he didn't completely get it. He didn't completely get it. And straight away, Jesus rebukes him and tells him to get behind me. You don't know what you're saying. Because Peter was thinking that Jesus was going to be a king who was going to reign through military power. But Jesus challenged that. Yes, he is going to be a king. He is a king. But he's a different type of king. And he teaches from the prophet Isaiah about the suffering servant, the messianic king who's going to suffer and die for the sins of his people. And Jesus positions himself to be a king who's going to reign by serving others and by laying down his life for his people. But Peter and the disciples just didn't get that. And in chapters 18 and 19, Jesus starts on his fourth block of teaching about the upside down kingdom. A kingdom where the first will be last. A kingdom of the servant king where you gain honour by serving others. And instead of getting revenge, you forgive others and you do good to your enemies. You get true wealth by giving your wealth away to the poor. To follow the servant Messiah You need to become a servant yourself. And that then takes us up to our passage that we've got today from Matthew 20, when Jesus once again predicts his death. And now, as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside and said to them, "We're going to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death, and they will turn him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. And on the third day, he will rise to life." Jesus told them exactly what was going to happen to him. He said he was going to be handed over. He was going to be condemned to death, mocked, flogged, crucified. He knew it wasn't going to be an easy death. He knew it was going to be a horrible, slow, painful, brutal execution. But suffering was integral to the work of the Messiah, and suffering defined what it meant to be the Messiah. But the good news is, suffering isn't the end of the story. Because he says, yes, I will be handed over to be mocked and flogged and crucified, but on the third day, he will be raised to life. Tragic death is followed by a glorious resurrection. And after Jesus predicts his death for the third time, we then have a passage where it just shows the disciples really did not get it. They failed to recognize the necessity of the cross. They didn't understand this upside down kingdom. Because when Jesus first predicted his death in Matthew 16:22, Peter took him aside and rebuked him, because death didn't feature in the disciples' view of the Messiah coming. This time, it's the mother of James and John who takes Jesus aside. And she asks him for her sons to have key posts in the kingdom. Grant that one of these two sons of mine might sit at your right hand and the other at the left hand in your kingdom. Maybe she thought of his kingdom, of him sitting back on David's throne and being able to have her sons as her right hand and left hand men right at the front of the action. But that's not the kingdom Jesus was talking about. The other disciples also didn't get it. Because what was their response? Verse 24. When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. And Jesus called them together and said, "The rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave." You see, for the 10 disciples, their minds were focused on seniority, on authority, on importance, and they got upset because they thought James and John were going to take those places. And what was Jesus' response to James and John? He told them they didn't know what they were asking. You don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink? And Jesus was talking about his cup of suffering. Can you take part in the suffering that I'm going to go through? And I don't know what James and John were thinking of, but they said, yes, of course we can, Jesus. Of course we can drink from the cup that you drink from. Of course we can. And then Jesus turned to them and said, "You will indeed drink from my cup. But to sit at my right and my left, that's not for me to give. These places belong to those for whom they've been prepared by the Father. So don't ask me. Not my job to give you those places, but you're right. You can drink from my cup." And if you look in Acts 12, verse 2, You can read of James's execution at the hands of King Herod. So yes, he did know suffering. And John was banished to Patmos, where he had the visions that you can read about in the book of Revelation. Jesus took this passage, he took it as an opportunity to give his disciples another lesson on leadership. Have you not got it, you 12? I've been teaching you for the last 3 years. I've been modelling for you what my kingdom is like. My kingdom is an upside down kingdom. The first will be last. You need to serve others. So different to the leadership we see in the world. In the world, leaders are served and leaders tell others what to do. And their leadership is often about exploitation and power. Not so in Jesus' kingdom. In Jesus' kingdom, leadership means service to those you lead. Leading in Jesus' kingdom is the opposite of what's expected in the world. A leader in Jesus' kingdom has got to come alongside others to serve them and to help them, to enable them to achieve what they need to achieve. If I think about great examples of leadership in the world, I actually think of mothers. Because what do so many mothers do? They nurture and they lead their children and they teach them the ways. And they help them to grow up into maturity. And a mother knows she's done a good job when her children fly the nest and are independent. Yeah? Good Christian leaders need to emulate this, serving their followers whilst also teaching them the values of the kingdom. And as a leader, Jesus didn't ask his followers to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Another mark of a good leader. He came into the world as a son of God, yet he didn't live perhaps as people would expect a king to do. He lived a humble life. He came to serve others and to ultimately die. And it says in verse 28, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. That takes us to our Old Testament reading today from the book of Leviticus. I think Leviticus is a wonderful book. And I was tempted to have the whole of Leviticus as today's reading. But I thought perhaps not. Perhaps you may not want the whole of Leviticus. So I just chose this one passage. Leviticus, the third book of the Bible. And Leviticus is set right after the exodus of the Israelites from their slavery, when at the foot of Mount Sinai, God invited them into a covenant relationship with him. But the people rebelled and they broke that covenant. And what God wanted was for his glorious presence to come and live in the midst of his people. And he set up his tabernacle so he could live in the midst of his people. But Israel's sin had damaged the relationship between the people and between God. And right at the end of the book of Exodus, it said that Moses couldn't even enter the tent to meet God. And the beginning of the book of Leviticus, it starts by saying, the Lord called to Moses, and he spoke to him from the tent of meeting. So God was in the tent of meeting and the people were outside. And the people couldn't go in. He spoke from the tent. And the question is, how can the people of Israel be reconciled to God so they can meet God? And Leviticus is all about how God's graciously providing a way for a sinful, corrupt people to live in his holy presence. And the passage we had today from Leviticus 25 It's a part of Leviticus which is to do with rituals. Rituals and rules, and it's to do with the laws of the Sabbath year. The Sabbath came once every 7 years. And if Israelites, if a person became poor, they had the option of selling themselves. And they could sell themselves to somebody else. So they could live. But any member of their family could come along and pay them back. They could pay a ransom for them. And the cost of the ransom depended on how many years it was until the year of the Jubilee. So if there's 6 years left until the year of Jubilee, you've got 6 lots of the money to pay. But if there's only 1 year left until the year of Jubilee, the price is going to be lower because there's not as long left. And then on the year of Jubilee, it sets out in Leviticus, everybody went back. So you had your own lands again, you were individual people again, and then you'd start again. So that was the plan that there was. So if you sold yourself, a ransom needed to be paid to redeem you. There was a cost of redemption. A price had to be paid. For us, there is a cost for our redemption. There is a price that has to be paid so we can get into that relationship with God. But the good news is, for us, that price has already been paid. And that price was paid once and for all on the cross. We don't need to wait for every 7 years now. It's done. It's completed. The price has been paid. The bank account has been cleared. There is nothing that we owe. Jesus did that once and for all, for the ransom for us. So when Jesus was talking about being a ransom, because Jesus knew his scriptures, he knew what he was referring back to. He knew about ransoms. And he said, just as the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. He didn't say, I'm giving my life as a ransom for the 12 disciples and only the 12 disciples. He didn't say, I'm giving my life as a ransom for the people of Israel, but only the people of Israel. This is an open invitation. The price has been paid. So what's the redemption cost for us? Well, Jesus already paid it. He's paid it with his life. But are you willing to be redeemed? Are you willing to accept that the price has been paid? Or are you going to live as if that debt is still there? So as I think about our readings today, it makes me think, what have we learnt? Well, we've been reminded that Jesus' kingdom is an upside-down kingdom. One where if you want to be first, you've got to be a slave. We've learnt that in Jesus' kingdom there will be suffering, but that comes before glory. We've learnt that there's a ransom to save us, and that Jesus was willing to give his life as a ransom for many. So what difference will that make to you? What difference will that make to your life? What difference will that make to your week? Or will you just walk out of here and think that was a nice service and just go back home and carry on and not let it affect you at all? Or will you be challenged and think, what do I need to do differently as a result of what Jesus has done for me?
You have been listening to Bedhampton Church. Our prayer is that this helps you journey with Jesus and serve your community by sharing God's love and friendship. Subscribe and join us for more discussion at www.bedhampton.church. All material Creative Commons copyright. Contact us for more details.